Morning, everyone. Welcome to Public Accounts on March 10th. I would ask if I'll call the meeting to order, and I will state our mandate and review our statement of purpose and values as we do at the beginning of every standing committee on public accounts. So our mandate. The Standing Committee on Public Accounts is charged with matters concerning the public accounts of the province, the annual report of the Auditor General, and fiscal management. Our purpose and values state that the Standing Committee on Public Accounts is dedicated to improving public administration in partnership with the Auditor General. The committee examines the administration of government policy, not the merits of it. The committee strives to achieve consensus in its decisions whenever possible. Members take a nonpartisan approach to the work of the committee. So I'd like to welcome everybody here today, and I will ask for an adoption of the agenda. Gord McNeely. And so we have Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission joining us today, and so with us we have J. Scott MacKenzie, the Chair and CEO, Alison McEwen, Director of Petroleum, and I'd like to recognize Aaron Mitchell is also here in the gallery. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to you, and I'll have you review your presentation based on the Auditor General report. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are here this morning to talk to you about the mandate of the Commission with respect to petroleum pricing. We've provided your clerk with a copy of our presentation, which we will run through this morning. And perhaps we'll ask that if anyone has any questions, it might be best for all of us if we just hold the questions until we're through, and then we'd be happy to answer whatever questions that you have. So I'm going to give you just, what we're going to do is this morning I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission. We're going to focus primarily on petroleum, the Petroleum Products Act, and petroleum regulation in the province as well as in Canada. We're going to look at the pump price comparison in Atlantic Canada. We're going to discuss how we price on a weekly basis now here in the province. We're going to talk a little bit about just petroleum pricing in general, and we're going to talk about the recent changes we have made in response and in working with the Auditor General. So firstly, I just thought I'd do a little bit of an overview for you. We provided each of you would have received a personal copy of an overview of our commission. We sent this out a few months ago, which walks through every single thing we do and provides a précis on what we do. But just to recap, we have two primary functions. We have a regulatory function. What's we doing? Good. We have two primary functions. We have a regulatory function and we have a quasi-judicial function. And in the regulatory function, the bulk of our work is in lands protection. We are an advisor to Executive Council only. We do not make any decisions whatsoever with respect to applications under the Lands Protection Act. All we do is make a recommendation and provide advice to Executive Council. It is then Executive Council that makes a decision on any applications under the Lands Protection Act. But in addition to just receiving applications from corporations and non-residents for the purchase of land in the province, we also do investigations. We also review annual returns that are filed by corporations or individuals who are over the limits, well, not over the limits, but over the amount that's required before they hit their limits. In doing so, we have 3 regulatory analysts and a director that is responsible for that area. We also do petroleum products regulation, and we're going to talk about that today. On the regulatory side, we house the Director of Residential Rental within our commission. The director has a staff of 5, so there's 6 in that division within our office. And it is the director's responsibility to administer the Rental of Residential Tenancies Act. In doing so, the director and her staff, which consist of 3 intake persons, and 2 adjudicators, plus the director herself, receive applications under the Rental of Residential Tenancies Act to adjudicate disputes. Now, on the quasi-judicial side, we sit as an independent commission to handle quasi-judicial decisions, and those deal with electricity regulation and rates, water and sewer utility rates, except for the cities. We do not regulate the city of Charlottetown, Summerside, nor do we regulate Stratford. We only look after the water and sewer utility rates of small utilities in the province. We set auto insurance rates. We only set the rates. We do not have anything to do with the regulation of auto insurance other than the rates that can be charged. And we're lucky in this province that we have the second lowest auto insurance rates in the country, second only to Quebec. Petroleum licenses and prices, which we're going to talk about today, and Island Waste Management Corporation fees. We make recommendations with respect to what the fees should be, and we don't get many applications for that, although we do have one before us right at the moment that we're reviewing. Also, on the quasi-judicial side, we hear appeals. We hear appeals from decisions of the Provincial Planning Division. We hear appeals from all municipalities in the province. And those are appeals with respect to building permits, bylaw amendments, variances, and the like that you would expect from a planning side of a city or a municipality. We hear rental appeals. Although the Director of Residential Rental is housed within our commission, our commissioners actually hear appeals of the decisions of the adjudicators in that division. We hear property tax appeals. If someone doesn't like the assessment that's been made on their property and they've gone through all of the reconsideration channels that the province provides, they can appeal that assessment to us. Those are not frequent. The province has a very good system in place so that disputes with respect to real property assessments can be dealt with in a mediation type setting. And we also hear environmental appeals, but those are not as numerous as we would see under the planning division. And those types of appeals would be appeals such as someone who wants to either put in or widen a road or a right-of-way through a wetland area, that type of a thing. That's what we would see for environmental appeals. Before I go on, I should say I wanted to say that Doug Clough, as our vice chair, had fully intended to be here today. He is down with a bit of an illness and couldn't make it. So what I'm going to do is we're going to move on from our general functions into what we do under the Petroleum Products area, or in that area. Our mandate is set out in the Petroleum Products Act, and as this is the main section of the Act that gives us the authority to deal, us being the Commission, the authority to deal with petroleum in the province. And the purpose of the Act is to regulate the distribution and the sale of petroleum products, and by that we mean gasoline, diesel, furnace oil, propane, everything that is considered petroleum. And the mandate is also so that the Commission is to ensure that at all times a just and reasonable price for heating fuel, motor fuel, is charged to consumers and is also recoverable by licensees. So we have a balancing act. We are there to make sure that the price is reasonable for both the consumer, but it is also reasonable to the licensees who sell that product so that they can do so at a reasonable profit. Lastly, unlike other provinces that regulate, and we're going to get into that a little bit to talk to you about what other provinces do, but the Act says that islanders, regardless of where islanders live, should pay the exact same price. So when we set prices from tip to tip. In other provinces, there are zones. So for instance, in Nova Scotia, you will have a Halifax zone and a New Glasgow zone. So if you live in Halifax, you pay a different price than you do in New Glasgow. That's not what happens in PEI. It's one price, tip to tip. So, what do we do? Well, Our primary responsibility is setting minimum and maximum prices for all petroleum products. So we set an upper maximum, and we set a lower minimum. And retailers, whether they be in the furnace oil business or the gasoline business, can sell within that range of minimum and maximum. What we find in Prince Edward Island is that most retailers fall to pricing based on the minimum price that we set, not the maximum. I think it's the best way to put it. We determine the minimum and maximum margins that retailers are allowed to charge over and above their wholesale cost to them. So we set that as a margin. We license outlets for operations by retailers, wholesalers, and wholesale retailers. And we also issue product licenses for each of these as well. PEI was the first province to adopt price regulation as we have it today. By that I mean weekly pricing or bi-weekly pricing of product and regulating it based on a minimum and maximum price. Newfoundland and Labrador followed in, we were 1988, I believe, and Newfoundland and Labrador followed with regulation in 2001. New Brunswick and Nova Scotia followed in 2006. Now, all of the Atlantic provinces regulate gas prices through a utility commission or a tribunal such as us. And by that I mean in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick and in Newfoundland, it is the utility boards or the utility commissions such as us, independent administrative tribunals that are independent of government, as are we. And they are also set up to do other functions, as are we. We are set up to deal with, as I went through, a lot of regulatory and a lot of appellate functions. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland are also set up that way with multifunction tribunals to deal with matters. Nova Scotia hears planning appeals. Nova Scotia grants licenses. Nova Scotia deals with all types of things like we do. They don't have land regulation, but they do other things. They regulate casinos, for instance. That's one of the things that they do over there that we do not do here. So in Atlantic Canada, here in PEI, just so you know, there's a slight difference. Here in PEI and in Nova Scotia, there is a minimum and maximum price set for petroleum products. In New Brunswick and Newfoundland, however, there is no minimum price set. Only a maximum price is set. In Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, they do not issue press releases and do not on price changes. They only publish price adjustments on their websites. We issue press releases. We issue releases within the PEI information system when we change prices. So prices are regulated in these markets to provide a more stable price for gasoline. And regulation has shown that the price that is set by regulators is a more stable price than set in markets where it is unregulated. In unregulated markets, pump prices can change several times a day. They can change based on the time of day with respect to gas stations that find that early in the morning they're very busy as people are commuting. The price is set at a certain price. Then in midday, the prices drop. Because they're not as busy. And then at commuting time again, at supper time, prices go back up. This is all within one station in one area. We don't have that. We set prices, and that's it. In British Columbia recently, and you may have seen the news, British Columbia is an unregulated market. The price of petroleum products in British Columbia is significantly higher than the price of petroleum products in Atlantic Canada. Recently, the Utility Commission in British Columbia was tasked by the government of British Columbia, the provincial government, to look into the pricing of petroleum in that province. And I've had a number of discussions with the chair of the Utility Commission in British Columbia, and what their report shows, and my discussions with that chair confirm, is that there are serious concerns about the high price of petroleum products, primarily gasoline, in British Columbia, and that at the present time, the provincial government there is considering putting in price regulation and discussing it, although no steps have been taken as of yet. So, what do we do here? Where do our prices fall in relation to the rest of the country, in relation to the province? Unfortunately, I think it's very difficult to see that slide, but the coloring is, if you look at the colors, you'll see basically the higher amount, the green, the lime green chart. That's the national average for the price of retail gasoline from January 2017 through to the end of last year, December 2019. The national price is always higher than the price here in Atlantic Canada. The black line is the price for gasoline in PEI. The purple line is New Brunswick, and the blue line is Halifax. As you can see, the pricing right across the country and also in our Atlantic jurisdictions pretty well follow one another, almost in lockstep. Not perfectly, but almost. And you will see that our pricing in PEI is very comparable to the prices in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia. And just on that, just to give you an idea, this will give you an idea as to what the average yearly pump prices are in Charlottetown, Halifax, Moncton, and the Canadian average. You'll see that in all years we are below the national average, but very close to the prices that are in Moncton and Halifax. Now, we will talk about the fact that our pricing here is a little higher and should be a little higher because of the transportation costs and the method of which petroleum products are delivered here, but we are not much higher. And so in 2019, our average price for the year was $1.14. In Halifax, it was $1.13.9. So $1.14.7, $1.13.9. Very, very close. Moncton was $1.18. Canadian average was $1.20. Now, we were pricing on a bi-weekly basis up until this past August. And what we noticed was that there was significant volatility in the market in the first part of 2019. And so for the period July 18 to July 19, we saw that we had to interrupt prices from a bi-weekly pricing 13 times because of the increases and decreases or volatility in the market. We saw 7 extra decreases in prices, and we saw 6 increases in prices. This was a lot. And as a result of that, we took a look at this and we went to weekly pricing in August. So we had a volatile market, much more volatile than had been seen in the past. There were large fluctuations in the price. As I said, we had 13 interruptions. We consulted with the industry, with the petroleum industry, and in August of 2019, we moved from bi-weekly pricing to weekly pricing. So what this allowed us to do is set a price that was more accurately reflected the market price of the product, because the market price was going up and down and fluctuating at a great rate. This also aligned us with other Atlantic provinces, because in the other Atlantic provinces they do price on a weekly basis. Now, we still interrupt if the price fluctuates enough. And you would have seen today that this is the first interruption today in pricing that we have had since we moved to a weekly pricing method. And Mr. McHugh is going to deal with that and discuss that in his part of his presentation.
Okay.
So at this point, what I'm going to do is, and I know you may have questions, but please, we'll deal with all your questions at the end, but please, I'm going to turn it over to Alison McEwen, and he's going to walk you through our method and what we do in petroleum pricing, and he is also going to talk about what is going on in the market and why we interrupted today. So,
Sure, okay. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the Petroleum Products Act and the role that it plays in the lives of everyday islanders. As Scott has mentioned, the Petroleum Products Act is a very comprehensive form of legislation and quite unique in any other part of the world, for that matter, in that the Act gives the Commission the authority to grant licenses. So each wholesaler, each retailer has to come before the Commission to justify their reason for a license. It grants the Commission the ability to establish pricing on the other end of that, so that impacts both the islanders in terms of their personal budget, but also wholesalers and retailers in terms of the economic return that they can make. The Commission, in addition to granting wholesale licenses, also adjudicates and grants the positioning of retail licenses in various communities. So there's a lot of responsibility that goes with that, and therefore the decisions that are made in terms of pricing are certainly not quick decisions. They're decisions made within the context of knowing that there's a lot of players that can be impacted. And it would be my statement, if you will, for what it's worth, that the island consumer has been very well served by the Petroleum Products Act over the years. I mean, the legislation goes back to 1948 in its origin, and involved at that time was primarily the granting of licenses. It was only later on in the early 80s and subsequently in the mid-90s when we got involved with pricing, because it really only became an issue at that point in time. And you may remember the OPEC crisis of the late 80s that spilled into the mid-90s and such, and prices became very, very volatile. So that's when we got involved with that. Within that context, the Petroleum Products Act has delivered, in my estimation, a viable and competitive market. Islanders have a lot of choice, both in terms of where they buy their gasoline and where they purchase their furnace oil and where they buy their propane. There is a relative uniformity, as Mr. MacKenzie has indicated, to pricing across the region, and that across the province, I should say, and that notwithstanding that we do have some unique challenges, which I'll get into in a few minutes and such, in terms of that are unique to our province in terms of transportation and supply and distribution, which would justify higher pricing. It's quite often, however, if you checked our on any given week, that sometimes our pricing is even below our neighboring provinces and such. And as well, we have protected, I think, or the Act has protected the rural network, so that there is availability of gasoline and furnace oil at very competitive prices, both in Surrey and Charlottetown, in O'Leary, in Tignish. There's no need, if you will, or no urgent concern on the part of islanders in those remote communities to have to travel to urban centers to purchase gas at cheaper prices, if you will. So with that backdrop, I'll try to get into some of the nuts and bolts as to how we do pricing. And the first slide there just gives you an indication of the breakdown of the components that make up the posted price of gasoline, furnace oil, and diesel. And not to bore you with the numbers and such, you can look at it, but it does give the sense that there is, the price is made up starting with the Charlottetown rack price. There's a wholesale margin that's added to that. There's various taxes, the federal excise tax, provincial gas tax. In more recent days, there's been a carbon levy as well. It's been assessed. On top of that, there's a retail margin. There's a slight sleeve of flexibility within that, from 6 to 7 cents. And then on top of that is HST, which would result in a retail pump price. Similarly, for furnace oil, you would get the wholesale margin that's added to a rack price, and then the GST, which is in this province limited to 5%. Diesel is very similar to gasoline in terms of the breakdown as the various taxes that are involved. I might point out, you'll note that there's in the retail margin, I mentioned a relatively narrow sleeve there between 6 and 7. That's by design. And I mentioned earlier that the Commission has occupied itself or preoccupied itself with ensuring the viability of the rural network. The gap there between the minimum and maximum is relatively narrow, so as to avoid situations where urban stations, which might have certain economic advantages in terms of additional volume and other services, if you will, can't price at dramatically lower prices than stations in the country. So therefore, people in this particular province, which is perhaps not unlike other Atlantic Canadian provinces and perhaps the country in general, there's a lot of people that live in the country but actually work in the city. If there was a wide gap in that pricing, there would be temptation to purchase your fuel in Charlottetown when you're working and not back in your home community, and therefore there would be issues of access of service in some of those communities. So that has been a concern of the Commission over the years, and that is why that retail margin is the way that it is. If we'll go to the next slide, this will give you some sense of some of the dynamics of pricing. Excuse me, first and foremost, I suppose, we should mention that petroleum itself is a commodity, and it's traded on the New York Mercantile Exchange. It's traded on other exchanges in other parts of North America, but the one that's relevant to us is the New York Mercantile Exchange. Crude pricing is traded separately from refined product prices, which adds a further dynamic to the understanding of the average consumer. It is and has happened at times that crude prices have been tracking lower, whereas refined product prices, gasoline and diesel, have been going higher, which creates a bit of a challenge for people to get their heads around, and usually results in my phone ringing off the wall and such, if you will. But perhaps I can relate it in an example, because this happened not all that long ago, about 6 weeks ago, when we saw the crude price was starting to fall at the initial outset of the COVID-19, or the coronavirus, if you will. And as a result of depressed demand right across North America, we started to see crude prices falling. Within that context, all of a sudden, there was a spike in refined product pricing, which seemed to be a dilemma. What had happened in that particular week, there was no less than 5 refineries that were in a state of shutdown due to fires or maintenance issues that had happened. That's not normal that you would have all that many all at that one point in time. There was 4 of them on the Gulf Coast of the U.S. and 1 in the Central Atlantic states in New Jersey. The result of that was it shorted supply that was available for our market, and as a result, in following the fundamentals of supply and demand, you short supply, you end up exercising an upward pressure on the wholesale pricing. So sometimes it's counterintuitive, but there are reasons and logic behind it. The Commission sets petroleum prices starting with the New York Harbor price. Now, you might ask, why would New York Harbor be of any relevance whatsoever to us here in PEI? And the underlying reason is that it essentially is the proxy market for our only supplier, Irving Oil. Perhaps the best way to explain that is that on any given day, the captain of a tanker that has a load of gasoline and other petroleum products on it, he has the choice of either sailing down the Bay of Fundy in ice-free waters for 14 to 16 hours or so, and unloading his product at the marine terminal in perhaps Searsport, Maine, or alternatively in Revere, Massachusetts, and has immediate access within a 20 or 30 mile radius of millions of customers. The alternative for them is to, once he gets down past Yarmouth, he turns and sails all the way up the Nova Scotia coast, around Cape Breton, down Northumberland Strait. The odd time he runs into ice this time of year, so he has to hire an icebreaker to assist him. Finally gets into Charlottetown and pays mooring fees here, has to store the product for perhaps 30 days at a time, and then has to ship it from one end of the island to the other at a uniform wholesale price. So you can see, if you will, that there are some challenges that we face, both from a supply and distribution point of view, that make New York Harbor important. If over the long haul, our prices do not mimic New York Harbor, Harbor, or at least keep in line with New York Harbor, there would be the potential for a supply crisis, if you will. Now, it's not going to happen in the short term, but it could happen on the long term. So hence the importance of focusing on New York Harbor pricing. In addition to that, the Commission, our actual pricing model, I referred to the rack price before, centers on rack pricing because that is the wholesale price that the various resellers have to pay here. While we just have one terminal here, and it happens to be the Irving terminal, the supply contracts are national supply contracts at each of the wholesalers, whether it be, I hesitate to mention the brand names, but you know them all, the major ones that you would see when you drive down the street and such. Each one of those companies has supply contracts, and they're coordinated through this terminal here with Irving. As a result, that is the contract price which the reseller buys off of. At times, there may be, given the size of the company, perhaps a minor discount. Some smaller entities would also just pay the rack price. But that's the wholesale price. We have to focus on that in order to ensure the viability of the local resellers and wholesalers. Of course, the Charlottetown rack price rises and falls according to changes in New York Harbor price. The two, the rack price and New York Harbor, are essentially lockstep. At times, they veer. When we get to the model, you'll see that we monitor both prices to ensure that they do stay in essentially the same relationship. But there is a daily change of rack price, and as far as New York Harbor is concerned, because it's a commodity market, that price changes an infinite number of times during the day. We get, at the end of the day, an average price. It's a subscription service that gives us those numbers so that we can then input those into our petroleum pricing model. And again, as was indicated, that our source of supply for PEI is 100% from the Irving Refinery in St. John, New Brunswick.
I might just interject that the New York Harbor price is the base starting price used by all of the utility commissions in Atlantic Canada and in Quebec. So that's the commodity market price that sets the base price of all petroleum products in this whole New England and Atlantic Canada area.
Yep. The pricing model attempts to collect all of this data and indeed captures on a daily basis the changes that occur in New York Harbor and Charlottetown rack prices. Within that context, there is the need to convert, because New York Harbor prices are given in cents per U.S. cents per gallon. We have to convert to metric and to Canadian currency and such. That happens behind the scenes. But the pricing model essentially tracks the changes that occur on a daily basis for all three petroleum products. It then averages that information on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, and an annual basis as well to give us a year-to-date number. Within that context, we also, because the Commission, and I mentioned earlier, it's a fairly comprehensive form of legislation, but we also monitor and capture the volumes that each wholesaler and each retailer sells. So we're able to determine the sales patterns over the course of the year. We have to perform a weighted average calculation because, as you can appreciate, certain products are subject to seasonal volume fluctuations. Obviously, this time of year, more furnace oil is sold than in the summertime. And similarly, with regard to gasoline, there's a larger percentage of our gasoline sales occur in the summertime as opposed to the wintertime when the tourist traffic is here. That dynamic, if you will, that market dynamic is factored into the numbers as well, so that the commissioners, when they're given the information in terms of a proposed change, are aware of a live, if you will, of an accurate year-to-date average in terms of margin. And that's where these margins are set beforehand, and those are our targets that we're trying to reach to ensure, one, that there's viability of the wholesale network, and number two, just a reasonable pricing for the consumer. And with that, the panel then reviews the three prices: the daily price for each commodity, each petroleum product, the average change in the rack price for that over the week-over-week period, and as well takes into consideration the year-to-date weighted average for those products. In other words, if for some reason, if the market races ahead of us and our year-to-date is eroded, that would be a factor that the commissioners would take into consideration to ensure that we achieve at the end of the 12-month period the year-to-date number. Similarly, if in terms of the performance of the margin on a daily basis, if there's a surplus, then that would indicate that you'd have a reduction. If there's a deficit, then that would indicate that you have to have an increase, if you will. With that information, there's also the director's report, my report, which goes with them, and it essentially just encapsulates and summarizes the information in a more digestible manner. It provides some background information in terms of some of the underlying reasons as to why markets are changing, so that the commissioners have a better understanding as to why, what is happening at the moment. It also determines, or I shouldn't say determines, wouldn't we love to determine, but we attempt to comment on which way market trends are going, what we anticipate within the next 7 days. And then it provides some notional pricing recommendations that the commissioners consider. And it's with all of that information that the commissioners then have to make a weighty decision in terms of what's the right thing to do. Again, within the hallmark of those two goals, one, ensuring that there's a viable wholesale price so that attracts wholesalers to supply PEI so that islanders are guaranteed supply. At the same time, trying to corral that number so that islanders don't pay more or less than what they should, that it's a just and reasonable pricing. Some of the challenges this particular slide would entertain would be, what do you do, Mr. MacKenzie mentioned, we just interrupted this morning, if you will, what do you do if there's dramatic and dynamic changes occurring in the marketplace on a daily basis? We saw that in the past 24, actually the last 72 hours and such has been a fairly tumultuous time in terms of market pricing. Within the backdrop of the COVID-19 or the coronavirus situation, we have seen that volume has dropped off significantly globally, if you will, the demand for crude and refined petroleum products. And not to bore you, because you've no doubt seen it or heard it or read about it in the news and such, but where it started in China, which is the second largest consumer of petroleum products, they immediately restricted public gatherings, restricted air and rail and bus traffic, cut back on production activities, if you will. The result of that, in a very short period of time, reduced their consumption of petroleum products by about 30% or so, which equated to about 1 million barrels a day. So there was a downward pressure, and I think I might have referred to it earlier. We saw that about 6 weeks ago, or a month ago now, I guess, and yet within that context we had a spike in retail pricing for a short time because of those refinery situations. While all that was on the go, what we faced in the past 72 hours was the dissolving, if you will, of the OPEC-Russia agreement and alliance that has been in place now since 2014 in an attempt to coordinate production so as not to have too much oil in the market. And obviously their goal is to try to control the price and make it viable for them. That particular marriage lasted for a number of years, but blew up on Thursday afternoon and Friday morning, if you will, when Saudi Arabia had advocated that they should have an additional 1.5 million barrels a day cut. That in addition to the 2.1 that they had already agreed to before and expires on the 1st of April. The additional cutback of crude production, hopefully, had their goals been met, would have resulted in reduced crude production and therefore hopefully an increase in price for them, if you will. And their economies are extremely dependent upon oil revenues. For whatever reason, OPEC and Russia could not agree. I have my own theories on that, but I'll keep them to myself. But in any event, they could not agree. And indeed, not only broke up, but also then, almost in retaliation to each other, decided to increase production, if you will. Now that within the context of the fact that global consumption is already reduced. So it sort of was a double whammy, and it impacted markets, and we started to see it Sunday night, and then we certainly saw it on Mondays, where we saw a dramatic decline in wholesale pricing. That was brought to the commissioners, and they have the ability, the Petroleum Products Act gives them the discretion to take into consideration dramatic changes that might be occurring in the marketplace, whether they be to the detriment or benefit of consumers and the industry. In that particular situation, we saw a reduction in prices, so it was the prudent thing to do to entertain a reduction. Now, we have to, whenever you have that kind of situation, you have to kind of be very careful to monitor it on a daily basis, because it's subject to fluctuation the other way around and such too. But that hopefully explains a little bit why we had the situation that occurred to us yesterday. And it's not unique to us. That's occurring right across the country, and you'll probably see similar reduction in prices everywhere. The last slide for me, if you will, it just reflects annual sales. Just get your next one. Sorry. Yeah. Which reflects annual sales, and not to bore you with details, but it just gives you a sense in terms of what we go through here in the run of year. 500, it's a half a billion, I guess, isn't it? 500 million liters in the run of a year, and as far as gasoline is concerned, somewhere in the range of 235 million barrels, or million liters, pardon me. Now, to put that in some degree of context, while we would have 235 million liters, New Brunswick would have 1.1 billion. Nova Scotia would be closer to 1.4 billion, and Canada-wide would be approximately 45 billion. So the point there, if you will, the takeaway from that is that the role that we play, or the volumes that we have, necessarily position us as a price taker, not a price leader, if you will. From a theoretical point of view, because of that, as Mr. MacKenzie has mentioned, in theory we should always, one would think, pay a higher price here than you would in neighboring jurisdictions, because our volumes are small, our average throughputs per outlet are smaller. We have the geographical supply and distribution issues that I referred to before, challenges that we face. We don't have price zones like they have in the other provinces. We have a singular wholesale price from one end to the other. So there is some natural impediments or challenges that we have to face as a province in terms of trying to price. And yet, notwithstanding, our prices are very competitive, and indeed sometimes are even less than our regional neighbors. And that would take us through it.
So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things. In the report of the Auditor General's office, they had made some recommendations, and this is what we have done. These are the actions we have taken to each of the recommendations. The pricing methodology that we use was documented in the form as recommended by the Auditor General, and this methodology, which has been used for the last 20 years, and with the exception of the changing of the numbers in each of the price settings, the same policy and the same methodology was followed and continues to be followed. The next thing we did was there was a recommendation that this pricing methodology be more transparent, and that it be available to the public. And as such, we've expanded the description of this methodology on our website. And in fact, if you go to our website today, the methodology is very clearly stated there, and walks you through what we do on a weekly basis now to set prices, or as we did yesterday, we interrupted and the panel met and set prices, but the same methodology is followed. The other thing we did on the recommendation of the Auditor General was we provided more detailed information on current petroleum prices and just pricing in general on our website. So that information is also found on our website today. We published our policy for unscheduled price adjustments. And just so that you understand what we do here, we monitor prices on a daily basis and sometimes multiple times a day. We follow the commodities markets and the publications that are issued primarily by Bloomberg during the day to see where prices are going. So this is not something we sit down every week and just take a look at a price. We monitor it on a daily basis, and that's how interruptions happen, is because Mr. McEwen and his other staff who look at this would see that the market was, to put it in the vernacular, going crazy, and prices were crashing. And so in doing so, we watched it very carefully, and then met yesterday to interrupt. But that's what our policy calls for, is that there be daily reviews by staff, discussions with the commissioners, and then if it's deemed that the price change or the price fluctuations would warrant a change in our price here, then the commission meets. The other thing we did was we developed a financial tool with input from the industry to assess the adequacy of the margins for retailers. And as a result of using this tool, we completed the retail margin review, and we issued a decision in December of this past year, which increased the margins by 1 cent for the retailers. But at that time, we also set in that order notice that we would be reviewing the retail gasoline and the retail furnace oil margins in 2021, next year, for new pricing in both to come into effect January 1, 2022. If a margin increase, and the margins may continue the way they are, or there would be a margin increase if dictated. And lastly, I should also add, in addition to that, the commissions in Atlantic Canada have been discussing the setting of margins. Setting of margins is difficult. We in Prince Edward Island have somewhat of we're in somewhat of a more beneficial position, if I can put it that way, because under our Act, there is a lot of information that must be provided by wholesalers and retailers to us. They must provide their total sales volumes, etc. They do not have to provide that information in the other provinces. So the other provinces, when they go to do retail margin reviews, are somewhat in a little bit of a behind the eight ball position because they can't get the information from the industry. The last time there was a request in New Brunswick for a margin increase, they hired a consultant to go out and talk to the industry, and they got one retailer volunteered to talk to the consultant. One in the province of New Brunswick, because they were not prepared to give their information to that consultant. And PEI, we don't have that problem. We have very cooperative retailers, very cooperative industry, and we work with the industry to get actual information. As I said, we built a model, a financial tool, and it's based on actual numbers. Not theoretical, not survey, not anything else. It's based on actual results for these retailers. And that helps us greatly in arriving at a reasonable margin for them, and also a reasonable price for the consumer on the margins that they're entitled to charge. So our next review will be in 2021. We will be going back out to the industry again for input and also to the public. The last point, and I'm sorry, on that I should say, all of the commissions in Atlantic Canada had agreed to meet and discuss setting of margins. That did not occur this past year because New Brunswick and also Nova Scotia were in the midst of margin reviews, and they were not able to meet during that time. But our hope is that this year later we will be able to have that meeting to discuss margins and what's a reasonable way to set margins. Lastly, the Auditor General pointed out some sections in the Petroleum Products Act that were essentially vestigial and old, much like much legislation in PEI, but the Auditor General pointed that out to us, and we sent a request for amendments to the government suggesting that the vestigial provisions be removed. That has not made it through yet, but I assume it's coming. Just to show you some of the changes we made, if you look at our website now today, we have taken a page from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. We now have on the top of our website the current retail price. If you click on that retail price, it will send you to our page, which will provide you with a lot of detailed information on how that price is met. And in particular, it will send you to the page which breaks down precisely how the pump price of the product is arrived at, and also furnace oil. So just if we can just take a second to take a look at this slide, you'll see that the benchmark price or the base price from refineries of the product for regular gas is 55.5 cents. Then the wholesalers are entitled to charge 5 cents on top of that, which gives us a 60.5 cent base wholesale price. Then there's federal excise tax added to that, provincial tax, carbon tax, and that adds up to the full wholesale price. And then the retailers are entitled to, you'll see it's kind of split there. So the retailers are entitled to a 6 or 7% margin. And then on top of that is HST, and that gets to our price as it is this morning with a minimum price of 102.8 and a maximum price of 104. Same thing for diesel. Furnace oil is slightly different. The benchmark price is set, then there is a retail margin which includes a wholesale component, which comes up to a maximum price. Then there's only a 5% HST, no PST on furnace oil, which gives us a maximum furnace oil price today of 79.3 cents, which, by the way, is about 20 to 25 cents cheaper than anywhere else in Atlantic Canada. And that is because in New Brunswick it is regulated, but New Brunswick, because of its long distances, allows for delivery charges. In Nova Scotia, the price of furnace oil is not regulated. We also provide on our website a national comparison so that anyone can check to see where does our price fall within the region, and where does our price fall vis-a-vis national average. So you'll see that today the pump price in Charlottetown is $1.02. The maximum price allowable in New Brunswick today is $1.13.6. The price in Moncton is $1.09, and if you recall, in New Brunswick there is only a maximum price set, not a minimum price. That's why you hear about the Costco effect, people going to Costco and lining up, because Costco uses gasoline pretty well as a lost leader, and they sell it as cheaply as possible. But you'll see Fredericton's price is $1.10, Halifax, and then if we get into some of the other areas, Ottawa, Toronto, Ontario, and again, we were talking about British Columbia. You'll see that British Columbia is at $1.38, which is 35 cents more than we pay here. That is a pretty standard variation for the price of gasoline in the West. We have diesel price here, furnace price, and propane prices. So, questions?
Questions? Okay. We'll start with Carla. Do you? Well, we're going to start with Carla, but I'm just starting to build the list. So,
I'm really happy to hear the discussion around methodology. I know that was one of the issues that was identified in the Auditor General report in terms of, depending on who the Auditor General was speaking with, there was a discrepancy in methodology. And so I'm wondering, So I'm happy to hear that it's transparent and made public. When was this, did you say that this methodology has been used for, how many years did you say?
Probably 20 years.
20 years. So would you say that there's a difference in how you communicate that methodology? And what does that look like in staff turnover rates? Do you know what I mean? Like a staff turnover?
Well, there's definitely a difference in the way we communicate it. We have hired a communications officer that we've never had. The commission never had a communications officer. So we've hired a communications officer and come up with a communications strategy, if you will, or whatever, which has resulted in the changes that I showed you here on our website. The actual in setting out in detail so that people can read through it on our website. The actual process that we go through on a weekly basis for our price setting, it's just much more transparent. And sometimes, when you're in the weeds of regulation, it's often beneficial to have someone who comes in from outside and says, it's not clear. It's clear to the people who are doing it every day because it becomes rote. But it's always helpful to have someone say, try to look at it a little differently. And so that's what we did. And with the recommendations of the AG, and also bringing in our communications officer and looking at what could be done, we came up with a new method, and not a new method, but a new way of communicating to the public to try and be as transparent as possible. And that's an ongoing. There's some ongoing changes to that. And we've even updated our website more since we made the first changes. And we also have hired a company to assist with preparing a brand new website. And so our hope is that we will become even more transparent, and it will be easier for the public when the new website is put in place sometime around the middle of this year to get information on what we do and how we do it. As far as staff turnover is, we haven't had any staff turnover in the last, I don't know how long.
Just retirement, if you...
No, but in the retail petroleum industry, it's got to be 15 years
Okay.
that we've had the same staff.
Carla?
Whenever I was reading through this and looking at the margin applications received, some of the wait times were 14 months, 23 months. What would you say, is that kind of an average wait time for groups submitting margin applications, or is that?
We don't get very many margin applications. That's 14 months is not unusual at all across Atlantic Canada. 24 is a little bit long. But as you can see, what we're doing now is we've set time limits for our next margin reviews. In our decision in December, December of 2019, we have now called for another margin review within 2 years.
Okay, Carla?
And then in doing so, it will be dealt with faster than 14 months.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. Since the original Auditor General report, IRACs began meeting weekly to discuss the setting of petroleum prices.
Right.
What have been sort of the benefits to this change in policy?
The benefit of doing it weekly? The benefit is we get to deal with fluctuations in the market price quicker. That was a result of the fact that there had been more fluctuation in the market price. Prior to this year, prices would fluctuate a little, but not a lot. I shouldn't say this year, the last year and a half, I guess. But what we're seeing is that the market is really volatile, very reactive to any change anywhere, and weekly pricing allows for a more accurate price, and it allows for just better pricing in general for both consumers and for retailers.
And so,
Carla?
thank you, Chair. So based on that answer, you'll continue meeting weekly?
Oh, yes.
That's the practice since
That is,
2019?
yes, I guess we didn't discuss it, but when we started in August of last year to set weekly, we gave it a bit of a period of time through to October, first part of November, to see if we would continue doing it. And it was very easy to make the decision to continue on a weekly basis. So it will continue on a weekly basis.
Carla?
And in terms of the amendments that you sent to the Director of Legal Services, is it mostly removing kind of the old legislative stuff, or is there something that you're adding?
No, as of right now, all that we have sent to government is a recommendation to removing what we call vestigial provisions, which are no longer used. Not to go off too much on a tangent, but back in the 50s and 60s, there was no price change as we have it today, where the market is watched and the prices are changed in general. Back then, and these were the provisions of the Act that the Auditor General focused on and that we suggested be removed. Back then, the Commission itself wasn't doing the monitoring of the pricing, it was the industry. And if a wholesaler wanted to increase the price of gasoline, they had to make a formal written application to the Commission requesting a change of that, and the Commission had to have a meeting and a hearing to determine whether or not the price of gasoline would go from 10 cents to 10.75 cents and per gallon, which would have been at that time. That process changed, as we talked about earlier, when price regulation per se came in the sense of doing it on a biweekly or weekly basis. Those provisions dealt with the old application process where wholesalers would come in and ask. That hasn't been used since 1988. So those provisions were vestigial, they're no longer used. There's a whole new method. And so that's what we suggested be removed from the Act. We didn't ask for anything to be added.
Carla?
And what sort of conversations have you had with other Atlantic regulators about improving price setting policies and procedures?
Well, as I discussed, we were going to have a meeting this past year, which
Right,
we weren't able to get going due to the fact that other provinces were tied up. We do dialogue fairly frequently, but we are going to have further discussions with them over the next year to just talk about pricing in general and what goes on.
Should we let someone else have a turn?
Yeah, I'm going to go to Gord.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative. So just my questions have to do with the report, and I think you've answered some of those. Again, we see a lot in the report about rationale, transparency, methodology, those type of things that were coming, and I think you've answered a lot of those things. Let's just take the biweekly to weekly. How did you come to what was it, just in a meeting you talked about that, or was it something you were striving to get to a weekly? And when is that where it's going to end? Are you monitoring that, or are you going to do it like every 48 hours or 64 hours? Like, is there room to move in the future?
No, it didn't. It's been something that has been discussed at the Commission for a long time, ever since I've been there, which is 6 years. And bi-weekly versus weekly.
Yeah.
Okay. There was calls. Some politicians had said we should be going to weekly. We should be going to weekly pricing 2-3 years ago. We went out to the industry and we did not get that kind of response from the industry. The industry did not agree on weekly pricing. When we first went out and asked. We had something like 8% of the industry came back and said they wanted weekly pricing. Most of the industry wanted it left at bi-weekly. That was a different market, though, Mr. McNeely. That was a market where the fluctuation in the market price of gasoline was rather minor compared to the last year, a year and a half. It was the fluctuations might be 1 or 2 cents in a day. Now we're seeing huge fluctuations of 4 and 5 and 6 cents that can go in a day. That's what brought us to weekly pricing, because when we sat down and we were doing our pricing, we noticed this huge fluctuation, and that's when we decided we're going to have to move to weekly pricing. Not to mention the fact that because of the wide fluctuations, we had 13 interruptions.
Yeah.
So we were pricing 26 times a year, so we had to price 50% more again just to basically meet the market demands. And for that reason, we decided, no, we're going to go to weekly pricing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and that's a good. When I look at that, I think it's important. It is a volatile time, and we're seeing things. But I'm always worried about. Yes, we're at a position today where it's dropping, but I'm worried about where it's going the other way. So we have to kind of remember that.
I'm sorry, and also you had mentioned about 48 hours, and I don't. There would have to be some pretty serious fluctuations for us to go more often than weekly. Mm-hmm. No one else that we know of is doing that right now. And also, to be fair to the industry, to set prices on a 48-hour basis or whatever is pretty. That's a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, for sure, for sure.
For them to change prices.
For sure.
Gord?
And in 5.1, in here it says that IRAC has not sought amendments to the Act, and you've made it clear that you have, and I think Carl asked a few questions on that. But is it more than getting rid of the old stuff in the Act? And what are your top things that you're recommending for moving forward?
Well, we have a number of things that we're going to be discussing over the next six months or so. I think that the question of the approval of licenses for new retail operations. We are the only jurisdiction that we know of in Canada that does that the way it's done here, and that is on a public convenience and necessity test. So that if someone wants to put up a new gas station, in addition to convincing a wholesaler to supply them, in addition to convincing their banker to lend them money, in addition to convincing the municipality to allow them to build the station in the place they want to build it, they have to come to us and they have to prove on a public interest, convenience, and necessity test that a new station is warranted. As I say, we're the only jurisdiction in Canada that does that. In every other jurisdiction, it's left to competition. As Mr. McEwen has indicated, though, one of the basis behind this legislation is to try and have a complete service across the island. In other words, a rural network. So one of the things we're going to be doing over the next 6 to 8 months as a commission is taking a look at that. Mm-hmm. Not urban versus rural, but taking a look at, should we still be in this business? Mm-hmm. Or should it take care of itself from a competitive point of view, and from it's pretty hard when you've got someone that wants to put $3 million in the ground and they have a bank that's prepared to back them, to turn around and say no, can't do it. Now that doesn't happen very often. It's only happened once in the last many years. It must be 12 years. But it still puts the pressure on the commission to have to do this analysis, and it's not a cheap analysis. Those types of applications to the commission are comprehensive and expensive.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely stifles the free market.
And that's a question that we want to have within the commission. It's a question we want to have with the legislators, and it's a question we want to have with the public.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And you look at Nova Scotia, and I'm looking at the different prices, and when you were doing your report, I was wondering why we had that range and what the difference would be between a couple of the other provinces only setting a maximum, and I think you did answer that with the Costco kind of example where there's no floor. You know, in Nova Scotia, this is just, you know, when you said Nova Scotia, his rates for home heating oil is about 25% higher. Yes. Who's getting all those profits in Nova Scotia?
That would be shared between the retailer and the wholesaler.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was just a question. I'm good. Thank you very much.
And if I could give you a slight reason besides the fact that it's not regulated, which in and of itself would raise the price. Nova Scotia itself is a little bit of a different market because they have a number of options for home heating in Nova Scotia. Electricity is cheaper and easier, but natural gas, we have no natural gas. And so, as it's been explained to me, in Prince Edward Island, when a fuel oil truck goes down the street and there's 20 houses on the street, 19 of them are filled up with furnace oil. In Nova Scotia, there might only be 5 of the 20. The rest may be natural gas. And so it's more expensive for the people to provide the fuel in Nova Scotia because they have the economies of scale of being able to deliver to people who are in that market are different. I hope that's...
Yeah, no, that was interesting.
We'll move on to Rob.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Chair. I guess from my perspective, this is actually, when I first got elected, I think there was a bit of a review of IRAC and how the price adjustments went, and so it's kind of good to kind of reassure at least myself. What's that? It was a while ago, I must say. But I guess I'd always been an advocate and supporter for a regulated petroleum system in Prince Edward Island. And a lot of the rationale behind that was from my own perspective as a farmer, that this is a very large purchase that farmers will make in the run of the year when it comes to diesel purchases or gasoline in some cases. The one thing that and it kind of comes back to the rationale around switching from a bi-weekly adjustment to a weekly adjustment, and even shorter than that. One of the things that farmers are making are big purchases. I know myself, most of my purchases would be at least 2,000 litres at a time. And from my perspective, I was always trying to, I'd not say play the market, but trying to get a sense of where the prices were going so I could try to buy my fuel before the prices went up. Going down wasn't so much an issue. I could kind of plan around that a little bit easier, and so it was to try to take some of the variabilities out of my operation as a farmer. You sometimes couldn't always control commodity prices, but if you could kind of plan a little bit ahead when it comes to your diesel fuel purchases, it could make a fairly significant impact on the bottom line, especially when it spikes. So I'm a little concerned that you know, when especially when Gord was saying you could go to even shorter windows of time, and it's reassuring to say that weekly would be probably the most on that, but is there any thoughts of going back? Like, what's the implications from IRAC's perspective? How much more does it cost you to do the adjustments on a weekly basis versus bi-weekly? Maybe it's zero. Could you give me some impacts on that? Or
as a cost to the commission, no cost, no difference whatsoever. As I said, we monitor prices on a daily basis. We and sometimes multiple times a day. So it doesn't cost us anything. The commissioners are there at the commission, and if a meeting is warranted, a meeting is held. So there's no variable cost, if I can put it that way.
But from a perspective then, as a regulatory body on behalf of Islanders, is there any rationale to your decisions in speeding up the process of doing price interruptions, especially on the upside versus the downside?
Well, we would do that. If an interruption was warranted. Same way the prices have dropped today. If prices skyrocketed, we would interrupt as well.
Rob?
Okay, and the other was just one of the things that, as a rural MLA, I mean, I think there's 4 gas stations in my district, 1 fairly large, 3 very small. How much is the margin taken into account in trying to protect those particular smaller gas stations How is that? Is there a certain weight that occurs from IRAC's perspective? Because one of the factors I would look at in a fairly, from my own place, the nearest gas station, if there was just the one large one left, would be at least 20 kilometers away. So there's a 40-kilometer drive that I have to go to get my gas from greenhouse gas impacts and all those other things. And just the cost of operating in a rural area would be somewhat impacted in that. So I would hope that we would encourage that there's at least reasonable margins that are taken into account that provide options for those smaller retail dealers to at least survive and stay operational. I know from my own perspective, when there was a period of time where the one that was close to me did close down for a period of time, and it was pretty significant impacts it had on my household as well as my farming operation. So from that perspective, I wound up putting it in a bulk tank and bought fuel bulk was the most effective way to do that. But that comes with risks of trying to store that fuel and play the adjustments and things of that nature. So just feedback on small rural communities and gas stations.
No, I can assure you that when we looked at margins and made our decision in December, and we had, as I said, we had developed a model for participants in the industry to provide us with their actual numbers. We did it looking at both small retailers, medium-sized retailers, and large retailers, and we took all of that information. I think we had somewhere in the vicinity of 35 to 40 responses of detailed information from from those different sets, and we set small retailers based on the information we have concerning the volumes that are done in the province, because we know the volume on every single station. So we looked at that, and our model looked at what does a change, how is a change going to affect each one of these stations? We had a mandate to set a price for the entire province, so as you can appreciate, that in setting our 1 cent increase in the margin, the small retailers' information did have a definite effect on that. For instance, in New Brunswick, their review was a 0.3 cent increase in the margin when they did theirs. And so we definitely went up a cent because we hadn't looked at it for a while. But I can tell you that a significant factor that went into that was where are the small retailers and the medium-sized retailers? How are they being affected? Are they covering their costs? How much of an increase do they need? If you took, and not to get into the weeds on it too much, but if you took a look at the large retailers anyway, it might be hard to justify any kind of an increase. But those are, you can count them on one hand, the number of those large retailers. There are a lot more medium and small time retailers, and their numbers more than definitely justified a 1 cent increase in the margin.
Rob?
Well, that's just reassuring because, like I said, there are more factors in, like I say, how far you have to drive to get your petroleum products. So, which impacts greenhouse gases and things of that nature. So that should be added into the equation, but I think it's important to do that. But anyway, my other final point was, so what are the impacts on retailers when price adjustments occur on their own inventory? So I'm just looking at my own local gas station, when they fill up the tanks and then the price drops a number of cents a litre after that, and they have to regulate. So there'd be taking a bit of a loss. Invariably, when it goes the other way, I see the gain on that, but maybe you could explain that, and is that weighed into any of the decision making on what price adjustments would occur? Or?
I'm going to defer to my director.
Okay, well, certainly, you raise a very good point, because anytime the Commission adjusts the wholesale price, that immediately impacts inventory that a particular retailer would have. It impacts wholesalers as well, but they're better positioned to deal with it. But more importantly, the small rural retailer, and even the larger ones in town. The Commission certainly does take it into consideration, and I could refer you to a number of discussions where we've been trying to determine the exact right price, and that issue has come up. The commissioners have raised themselves. What impact is this going to have on the retailer? And we quite often name them because we know them all. In theory, it should balance itself out. Typically, certainly with regard to interruptions, which are somewhat significant adjustments upwards and downwards, there's usually underlying causes for that, and when you get a sharp decrease, eventually that will come back up again. Even with the notional adjustments that are happening, because of the dynamics of the market, if you will, there should be, in theory, an equal number of opportunities to make up for it. Of course, when we underwrite their inventory and cost the money with a decrease, alternatively, when we have an increase, that causes an appreciation. Now, within that context, you have situations where a particular retailer on a particular day might have just filled his tanks and such, and that's a tough one, right? That's a direct cost out of his operating budget, and that will take a while to get back. It may be when the price increase goes into effect that he only has half his.
Yeah, I know.
So your point is well taken, and it is a concern for the Commission. I don't know if there is a simple and ideal answer to that question. There's always going to be winners and losers. The only hope that we can have there is to try to have to be aware of it, so that to minimize losses that might occur for retailers.
And if I could just follow up on that, it is a concern, but we are pretty well guided by what the price is. And that is the primary factor on what we have to make a decision on. Our hope was also going to weekly would allow perhaps smaller retailers to time their purchases a little to try and coincide with whether they think there's going to be an increase or decrease. I know that's difficult.
No, and that's the point I was making as a farmer. I was trying to time it too, We all want the best we can get.
And I'd encourage you to take, if you take a look at Bloomberg's commodity prices for petroleum, you'll get a very, and that's daily, and anybody can go on and take a look at it. That will give you a good indication of where the price of all petroleum products are going at any given day.
I guess that would be it. I just encourage you to make sure that I like to keep my local retailer profitable, and I try to make as many purchases at my local store as I possibly can versus in bigger centers, because I know they're important to me in the long term. So, thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Ola?
Oh, thank you. Well, I noticed your national comparison with gasoline prices, and it seems like we're doing really well here on PI with being lower taxes, but that doesn't really take into effect, for instance, that this PEI lowered the local provincial gas taxes on 2 occasions, both under the Gist government and under the McLaughlin government, versus BC instituted a hefty carbon tax, which they then return. So it doesn't really give a good picture on what the actual markup is. Do you have the markup information on the various provinces?
The short answer is no. We don't follow that on a national basis. We do regionally, but we do not follow those markups on a national basis.
Ola?
I can't, but what I can tell you in British Columbia, though, that the finding of the Utility Commission in the special investigation that it did found that there was 13 cents in the price of retail gasoline in BC that could not be justified on extra taxes or wholesale prices of gasoline. So that's what's caused BC the concern, is that there's this phantom 13-cent margin that has been added to gasoline. There's no answer as to why.
Okay.
And so, anyway.
I'm not really doubting that we do have excellent prices here. I was just curious as to how you looked at it. If I understand you correctly, we have a very narrow margin that you, for the retail price, about 1 cent, and almost all resellers sell it at the lower rate.
Yes.
So essentially, you set the price, which is fine as it is. I was just wondering, do you actually have a mandate to set the price, or do you have a mandate just to regulate it and give it more of a range? So the question is, for instance, if there is a 1 cent margin right now, why do you have to legislate markup, why don't the retailers just mark it up 1 cent if they have the range?
They do have that option. Like we set the retail margin at a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 7 cents. The legislation requires us to do that, requires us to set a minimum and a maximum price. Now, each retailer is entitled within that cent to either charge a 6-cent margin or a 7-cent margin, or something in between. It's up to them. Most charge 6 cents. Some charge 7. Usually the 7-cent margin is charged by a smaller retailer in perhaps a more rural area where they don't have the volume that the urban stations have. But does that answer your question?
Well, sort of. I guess the next question that follows is if almost all the retailers use the lower price, why don't you make the range lower to give the consumer the benefit of that possibility?
Well, our mandate is to ensure that the price is reasonable for both the consumers and the retailers. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but and that's why, and in this province, we have to set a minimum and a maximum. So based on the information that we have been able to obtain from the industry, our determination is that for retail margins, that lower margin of 6 cents is what the low margin should be, and 7 cents is what the high should be. So it's a balancing act between consumers and retailers.
Ola?
Just one more question. I think most of the products arrive by boat, which is great, but I think some comes in by truck. Do you allow for differences between there must be an extra cost of trucking in? No?
The consumer does not pay, the retailer or the consumer do not pay more.
Yeah.
The price is the price.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sid?
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Scott and Allison. Your slide about the New York Harbor exchange and then deciding the Charlottetown rack price, is that the commission that decides the Charlottetown rack price?
No. I'll let Mr. McEwen explain what the rack price is.
Okay. Now, I'm sorry.
No, he just asked whether we set the Charlottetown rack price.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's set by industry, if you will, to reflect, what cost recovery they need in order to be able to supply to this market.
Sid?
Thank you. So how does it go from the New York price then to the Charlottetown rack price? Is there a formula for that? When you say industry sets that, is that also on that exchange? Or I'm just trying to understand the entire process. It's just from the New York to that Charlottetown rack price is what I'm wondering about.
No, there's no precise formula, if you will. They do tend to track together, if you will, or because they represent the same notion. Prices in the commodity exchange react to supply and demand dynamics and market dynamics, if you will. Similarly, the wholesale rack price has to kind of respond to those dynamics also. So we find that they tend to be in relative coordination in terms of adjustments.
But I think it's fair to say what the rack price is. I think the best way to describe it is the base price that refiners are prepared to sell into this market.
Sid?
And is that a negotiation between the wholesalers and anybody else, or is that just something they present to PEI? I'm just wondering where that number comes from. There was a lot of detail, but everything.
Yeah, the rack price is published by each wholesaler, if you will. It's totally determined by them. We monitor New York Harbor to, if you will, for the lack of a better expression, keep them honest, to ensure that there isn't a wide divergence and a gouging that occurs, and that's why both numbers are tracked.
Okay, that makes more sense then. So that, and what I'm trying to get at is where you actually have the possibility to affect change. So you don't have the possibility to affect change on that rack price. What you do is have an ability to monitor that rack price isn't getting out of hand compared to the New York.
Yeah.
Do you have any repercussion for that though? Like if you did see it getting farther and farther away. Do you actually have any levers to affect change?
Well, so if there was some evidence, which is not the case, but if there was some evidence of a gross price gouging, the Commission could adjust its wholesale margin to. First of all, I suspect we would call them into the Commission to discuss it as to why that was the case, and they'd have to justify it. But secondly, the Commission's the comprehensive powers of the Petroleum Products Act would enable them to adjust wholesale pricing to accommodate that.
If it turned out the rack pricing was not a good basis upon which to price for the reasons you're talking about, we could certainly change that, because our mandate is to set the actual sales price. So we can deal with the wholesale margin and also deal with the retail margin. But we track this daily, and from what we've seen, I think, and even before my time, the rack price and the New York Harbor price are always kind of in lockstep. And it's not, I guess what I'm saying is, the rack price is not increasing vis-a-vis the New York Harbor price.
Sid?
Thanks. It might answer my next question and about, is it even worth your while to be, monitoring that? Are you bringing value to it? Like, are we at the point where a simple formula would do this? A trigger price, like we see with the stock market with the circuit breaker, something that could easily trigger a daily or a interruption amongst the week. To me, right now, even at a weekly price, you could set a formula and just make it announced every week without having to interfere. But I guess my question was going to be, are you adding value to it having to do all this extra work? But if you are monitoring that rack price versus the New York Harbor price, that certainly keeps things in check as well. What I'm trying to point out is you have very little control, actually. If you understand the process and you look at the numbers, you have very little control over the entire price.
That's true. Yeah. No.
And that's something the public doesn't necessarily realize.
Yeah, we have control over 5 cents at a wholesale margin,
Yeah.
and 6 to 7 at a retail margin, and all of the numbers in the formula, which we do have a formula. I mean, we do have a formula, and we basically price off the weekly average the same way that New Brunswick does, the same way that Nova Scotia does, the same way that Newfoundland does, with the ability to vary depending, the same way Nova Scotia does and the same way New Brunswick, depending on whether somewhat of a variance of the strict mathematical formula is called for. I wouldn't say there's a lot of extra work in gathering the information. It's just one more column to fill in on a mathematical spreadsheet.
Sid?
Thank you. The recommendations on 4.9 and 4.17, so IRAC should make its petroleum product pricing methodology available to the public, which it's there. And then the other one is about clearly communicating the information to the public on the key factors that support each pricing decision. I wouldn't scream that it's still clear. Like, it is complex and it's hard to make that a simplified message. I get that. I fully expect that a website redesign or hoping some sort of a simplification of that message will come with that as well. Like when I looked it up this morning and tried to go over it myself, I think you do need to sit through a presentation like this sometimes to get all that done. And it's easy for me to sit here and say you need to simplify it more, but it's still tricky and it's still not convenient. But I do think that if that's what's going on with the website review and a changing of that communication, I think will help.
I mean, that's a fair comment. I mean, it's a work in progress. It's always a work in progress.
Yeah.
We've taken great steps to put information on our website. It's a two-page explanation of exactly what we do.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, it's a little complicated.
But communication is going to help that, right? Like,
Yes,
with
we're hoping.
a part right at the top, this is what we actually control, the 5 and the 6 and the 7.
Yeah.
And then this is what your government does, this is what your federal, all those other things. I mean, I think that's coming with the communications officer, all that stuff will happen. So I'm not
Correct.
so much concerned with that at all.
That's correct.
I have one more question,
Sure, go
and
ahead,
it's
Sid.
not necessarily on the AG report, but it's actually on a slide you had up there, it might be slide 17, about our furnace oil consumption. And
On the totals?
yeah, is it fair to ask you for any context on that, of why, like, I can make assumptions on why gasoline totals have gone up. Do you have any context on why you think furnace and stove oil sales have risen in the province, especially with such a drive for electrification in PI? That surprised me a lot.
Yes, well, of course, you're right. There's a number of factors that influence demand, and certainly in the long term, the conversion to heat pumps and what have you should in theory reduce consumption. Weather is a big factor. Degree days, to kind of go back and compare the winter of one year to the next year, would have a dramatic impact in terms of consumption from one year to another and such. I suspect that if you did that over, starting now and over the next 10 years, you'll see a significant reduction in it.
Oh, for sure.
And that creates another problem too, in terms of, going forward, the impact of that industry and the viability of that industry if there's a significant fall off in sales, and will there still be the same number of players that are involved in it now as will be then?
So
It's probably, I guess, it's probably more, as Mr. McEwen said, degree days. It's probably more to do with how cold it was during the heating months, rather than more people converting to furnace oil heat.
yeah, and then I don't mean for you to just make assumptions or guess. I was just wondering if you knew off the top of your head, like, there was an increase in applications for stations or companies, or more offering.
No, there's no increase in that at all, no.
I'm good, thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Sid. Carla?
You may have already answered this question. There's a couple of answers I've already heard, but you directed staff to conduct a review of the Commission's current practices of documentation and how it clearly communicates petroleum pricing decisions.
Yeah.
I've heard some of them. Are there any other outcomes of this review, or is this ongoing?
I don't know if there'd be outcomes. It's just that our minutes would clearly, our minutes would perhaps a little bit more clearly state the particular decision. And as part of our general communications, we try to communicate more information in the information we put on our website and the information we give to the press with respect to why decisions were made. But yeah, we're always trying to improve.
So
Carla?
is that review is kind of ongoing, would you say, or?
Yes, I mean, I think that's fair to say, that we just consistently do that. And just say, are our decisions appropriately worded so that it's understood? Have we put the proper information on the website? Have we given enough information in our press releases? Yes.
Thank you,
Okay.
Chair.
Yes, it's
Thank you.
always under review.
Okay, and I've exhausted, so I'll ask, is there any other questions? Okay. So at this point in time, there were 7 recommendations. I just quickly want to go through the 7 recommendations, if that's okay with the committee, and we'll get basically just a final short statement on whether it's in progress or if you consider it complete. I know that in Appendix A of the report, if you have it with you, you provided a response on December 14th.
Right.
So I just wanted to run through that quickly and you can let us know, is it complete? Is it still in progress? And if it's still in progress, what is the timeline in order for you to consider it completely implemented?
Okay?
Is that fair?
Yes?
So
I don't have it in front of me, but that's fine. You're going to read it.
I have 2 copies. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much.
So recommendation 4.8, IRAC should document and approve a policy on its methodology in setting petroleum pricing, and you had identified that this is complete.
Correct.
In your
That is
response.
correct, yeah.
Okay. Recommendation 4.9, IRAC should make its petroleum product pricing methodology available to the public. You've identified that you have done that. You've put it on the website. And on December 18th, the Commission published a petroleum pricing methodology on the website. So do you consider that one complete?
Yes, it's complete, but also just to follow up on Ms. Bernard's comments, it's an ongoing attempt to try and ensure that whatever we do is done in the best way and communicated in the best way. So
Okay.
It's always going to be improved, put it that
Okay,
way.
perfect. Recommendation 4.17, IRAC should document the key factors that support each pricing decision and clearly communicate this information to the public. So you, on December 14th, identified that you were conducting a review, and the Commission's staff were also directed to work with the Commission's new Senior Communications Officer. So is that a work in progress, or?
That has been done.
Okay.
Our website now clearly enumerates exactly what is
Okay.
done as far as key pricing, key factors in pricing.
Okay.
That's done.
All right. Recommendation 4.23, IRAC should document its review of prices and its considerations of an unscheduled price adjustment when interruption criteria in its policy are met. And you stated on December 14th of 2018, the Commission adopted a revised policy related to unscheduled petroleum pricing adjustments.
So that's done.
You consider that complete?
Yes.
Thank you. Recommendation 5.10, IRAC should seek any necessary amendments to the Petroleum Products Act. And you identified in your presentation that you have sent that to the Director of, give me the word? Legal Services, thank you.
Yeah.
So that now stands with the Director of Legal Services. Have you submitted all of your recommended amendments?
To date, yes, that's
Okay.
correct. But as I indicated, this year, over the next 6 to 8 months, we're going to be doing a review to see whether any more suggestions would be forthcoming.
Okay. Would it be your thought that the recommendations that you've put forward should be implemented prior to that review being completed, or if it should all be completed at the same time?
It could all be completed at the same time because what we recommended be changed is a vestigial provision that's not being used anyway.
Okay.
Like nothing happens.
And so your review over the next 6 to 8 months, I put it out to the committee. Would it be the committee's recommendation that 6 to 8 months, that there'll be a follow-up on that to see if there's further, so it wouldn't be something we'd include in our report or anything like that? We'd wait until IRAC's completed that review? Is that, any concerns around that? You good?
What do you mean by follow-up?
Well, to ensure that recommendation's fully implemented, once they've completed their full review of amendments to the Petroleum Act, that we would just follow up to make sure that one's closed.
What do you mean by follow-up? Like a
Well,
letter?
I put that out to the committee. Is it something we want to do? And if that's the case, how would we ask?
I think I should clarify. Our further review is not in relation to that particular recommendation. The work that was based on that recommendation is done. What I'm saying is this is part of our ongoing review of the Petroleum Products Act to come back to government with suggestions to talk about with the legislature as to whether there are other types of changes to be recommended. And I think Mr. McNeely was the one that mentioned it. Is there anything else we're doing to make suggested changes in the Petroleum Products Act? So with respect to recommendation 5.1, we consider that done.
Okay.
I guess what I'm saying is that we're going to do further work
Okay.
on what we do, how we do it, and why we do it under the Act, and make some recommendations to government.
Okay. So we'll consider that one complete.
Yeah.
As per your response. So recommendation 5.11, IRAC should develop and document policies and procedures for determining fair and reasonable margins for wholesalers and retailers. So in your response, you had identified that you plan to meet with the Atlantic Canada regulators in spring of 2019, which I know that was not able to be completed. So can you give us where you think that this recommendation stands?
Well, the other thing that what we have done is we have developed, we talked earlier about the financial model that we use for analyzing margin reviews. So that's done. So that's a big part of that. So when you talk about policies, procedures for determining reasonable margins, we've come up with a model to deal with that. As far as the meeting of the Atlantic Canadian regulators, as I said, we're hoping to have that done this year and later on this year.
Okay. So would it be your thought that this is complete? Or in progress?
We've completed the what I'd call the procedures and the policies with respect to the margin review for wholesalers and retailers based on the development of the model that we have done. But again, like we talked earlier, it's a work in progress. It's not a final thing. So that in 2021, when we go back out to the industry to have them provide us with information for price setting for January 1, 2022, those particular models that we've done may change, may improve, hopefully would improve. So has it been done? I'd say yes, it's been done with the exception of the meeting.
So your baseline's been completed and it would be updated as you see fit going forward, but the basis has been completed?
That's a fair statement, yes.
Okay. And then recommendation 5.12, IRAC's process for assessing and reviewing applications for margin increases should be transparent to wholesalers and retailers.
Right. And I guess what I can say is that we've made strides in that to the extent that we have dealt with the industry and used the models to set the last margin review. But again, we will be doing more work on that between now and 2021 for the price setting that's going to be set for January 1, 2022. Okay. So we triggered that in our decision to the industry, so the industry knows this is coming, and we will be working on sort of updating and improving what we've already prepared so far as a model and information that we need from the industry to be able to make a decision. I hope that's clear.
So would you consider this recommendation implemented? That you have?
I would say not 100% implemented. No, I think it's fair to say, Madam Chair, that we have made headway in that, but we still, between now and 2021, when we go back out again to the industry, there will be more work done on that. Okay.
So that would be the only one that I would have identified as to be implemented, I guess, from walking through that.
I think it's fair, though, to say it's been implemented. It's just going to be, it's going to be improved.
Okay.
We've already started work on it. We've already dealt with it in our last margin setting, where the decision was December. But there's going to be more work done between now and the next margin setting, which is in 2021.
Okay. Okay. Any items on that? So I'll just ask for a decision by the committee on follow-up. So as we know, the schedule of the Auditor General is to do a first follow-up 3 years after the initial report has been completed. So that would be next year, would be the Auditor General's follow-up, because they're doing first-year follow-ups on 2017 this year. So for the 2021 AG report, which would be due a year from now, they would be following up on their recommendations at that time. So would the committee like to see any further follow-up prior to that, or shall we just wait until the AG completes her 2021, or the AG completes the 2021 follow-up?
I don't need any more follow-up other than the AG.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you very much for coming in today. I appreciate your time and your I know you would have taken quite a while to build this report and to give us this thorough of a presentation, so I appreciate you coming today. Thank you very much. We'll take just a really quick short break.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. So the next item on our agenda is review of correspondence, and we do have one letter that is scheduled to go out to Sherry Gillis.
Has gone out.
It has gone out, and that is just to follow up on when they presented on maintenance enforcement. Has the committee received any correspondence that they'd like to share? No? Okay, and so we'll move on to review of scheduling. So next week, we do have IIDI coming in, and do we have it confirmed who's attending with them?
I have no update on that. It was communicated to me that the executive director and the deputy minister would attend, and I asked for clarification if the chair of IIDI would attend as well, and I haven't received a response.
So at this point in time, we're not quite sure who all will be coming in, but we'll leave it at there. And then we do have Jane McAdam scheduled to come in on the 24th, and a follow-up session on the 31st if we have not completed on the review of the 2020 AG report. And
No, the
we done?
31st, we have the Department of Finance to talk about property tax and corporate taxation.
oh, I had that wrong. Okay, sorry about that. So, what month are we in? March. March 31st, we have Department of Finance. It does fly. Department of Finance coming in. One thing I will let everybody know, I did talk to Jane earlier, late last week, just to make sure that, the AG report is going smoothly and everything for her, and she has confirmed that it will be in on time, which means it will be presented prior to March 15th, and she will not likely submit it on the Friday, on the Sunday, so we can expect it the later part of this week for the AG report to be tabled. So that was the only update I had on that, and then after, we don't have anything scheduled after March 31st. And then we can move on to new business. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to bring up as new business? No? All right, so if that's everything, then we can adjourn. Motion to adjourn? We got Carla. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.